empire stretched across the Mediterranean world, a dominion forged in conquest and sustained by an iron will. For centuries, Rome was an unstoppable force, its legions marching across continents, its laws binding disparate peoples under a single, magnificent banner. Before we continue, please like and subscribe. This vast edifice, built upon the sweat and blood of countless battles, seemed eternal, a testament to human ambition and military genius. Yet beneath the veneer of imperial grandeur, the foundations began to show deep fissures, cracks that would eventually give way to ruin. The very machinery that propelled Rome forward began to seize up. The sheer scale of the empire, once a source of unparalleled strength, morphed into an overwhelming burden. Maintaining the intricate network of roads, fortifications, and legions required an ever-increasing flow of resources and manpower. The external pressures, relentless and varied, tested the empire's resilience in ways it had never before faced. Barbarian tribes, pushed to the frontiers by migrations and internal strife, began to press against the very edges of Roman authority. The military structure, once the engine of expansion, gradually became a source of internal weakness. The emphasis shifted from conquering new lands to merely holding existing ones, leading to a reliance on increasingly unreliable external forces. The quality and loyalty of the soldiers, once unwavering, began to erode as the demands of the empire grew heavier, and the pay often lagged behind the necessities of the frontier. A critical turning point arrived with the dramatic shifts in political leadership and the ensuing military decisions. The internal struggles for control often consumed the energy that should have been directed outward against external threats. Decisions made in the halls of power, driven by short-term political expediency rather than long-term strategic necessity, proved disastrous. Consider the protracted crises along the Rhine and Danube frontiers. These borders were not static lines. They were dynamic zones of constant negotiation and conflict. Need to defend these vast territories required immense resources, and the choices made by generals and emperors in managing these defenses carried catastrophic weight. Sometimes, a strategic retreat, intended to preserve forces for a more decisive engagement, instead became a fatal abandonment of territory. The complex interplay between military necessity and political reality created a deadly paradox. Commanders were often forced to make choices that balanced immediate tactical gains against the long-term stability of the state. A decision to divert legions to quell a revolt in the Balkans might secure a temporary political advantage, but it simultaneously weakened the defenses against a more existential threat emerging from the east or the north. These calculated risks, often based on flawed intelligence or overconfidence, accumulated into irreversible losses. The later reliance on federated barbarian groups, while offering short-term manpower solutions, fundamentally altered the nature of Roman military command. Integrating these groups required political compromises that often undermined the traditional Roman ethos of singular, disciplined command. The loyalty of the army began to shift from the abstract concept of the Roman state to the immediate needs and allegiances of individual commanders. The final collapse was not a single, sudden catastrophe, but a slow, agonizing unraveling caused by a series of compounding military and political errors. The inability to effectively manage the shifting demographics, the corruption within the administration, and the strategic misallocations of vital military assets all contributed to the terminal decline. The final decisions made by those in power, often prioritizing internal squabbles over the survival of the state, sealed the fate that had been slowly eroding for generations. The magnificent structure of Rome, once the unshakable heart of the world, finally succumbed to the weight of its own unsustainable choices. As the pressure intensified, the very fabric of Roman society began to fray under the strain of these systemic failures. The wealth that once flowed into the imperial coffers, once fueling monumental public works and the maintenance of the legions, became increasingly diverted into internal conflicts and the lavish demands of an increasingly fractured elite. Provincial governors, once instruments of Roman order, devolved into regional strongmen, their primary allegiance shifting from the Senate and the emperor to their own local power bases. Corruption became endemic. Bribes were exchanged for safe passage, taxes were arbitrarily inflated, and the promise of Roman justice dissolved into the harsh realities of local despotism. This internal rot was compounded by economic instability, debasement of coinage, a desperate measure to fund endless wars and appease an ever-growing military, led to rampant inflation, crippling trade, and a breakdown of the established economic order. Small farmers, the backbone of the Roman army and the tax base, found themselves trapped in cycles of debt, unable to compete with inflated prices or the demands of increasingly predatory landlords. Urban centers, once beacons of culture and commerce, suffered from plagues, neglect, and a growing sense of alienation, as the once unified civic identity fractured into localized, often warring factions. The sophisticated legal and administrative structures, designed for a cohesive empire, proved too cumbersome and brittle to manage the chaotic realities of a decentralized and increasingly desperate populace. Sophisticated infrastructure, the very arteries of the empire, began to decay. Roads fell into disrepair, aqueducts were neglected, and the sophisticated systems of public works faltered, mirroring the decay of the political will that once commanded them. The great philosophical and legal traditions, which had provided the framework for Roman civilization, found themselves struggling to provide solace or direction amidst the encroaching chaos. The immense scale of the empire, once a source of awe, transformed into a sprawling, unwieldy entity, a collection of disparate regions struggling for survival under the shadow of a failing central authority. A sophisticated machinery of governance, designed for a world of relative stability and predictable order, proved incapable of adapting to the relentless, unpredictable pressures of the late antique world. The grand narrative of Roman invincibility, once recited with unwavering certainty, began to sound hollow, a mere echo of a power that had lost its grip on the very reality it sought to control. This disintegration was not merely a political failure. It was a profound cultural and material collapse. The sophisticated systems that had defined Roman ingenuity, the engineering, the law, the administration were no longer tools of order, but monuments to an unsustainable complexity. As central authority weakened, local power structures asserted themselves with brutal efficiency, carving out autonomous spheres where Roman law held little sway. The very concept of the universal Roman citizen dissolved into a patchwork of competing identities, each group defining itself against its neighbors, their shared history becoming a contested memory rather than a unifying narrative. The grand public works, once symbols of imperial might and benevolence, were left to the elements, their marble facades slowly yielding to ruin, a tangible metaphor for the empire's spiritual exhaustion. The decline of civic virtue meant that the ideal of gravitas and pietas was replaced by immediate self-interest, a transactional existence where survival dictated action rather than adherence to abstract ideals. Sophisticated infrastructure, once the arteries of imperial life, became choked veins, their sophisticated water systems stagnant, their stone bridges crumbling under the weight of neglect and the relentless march of entropy. The very language and intellectual pursuits of the age shifted, moving away from the structured rhetoric of the classical world toward a more localized, often superstitious, and ultimately fragmented existence. The echoes of the past, once vibrant, faded into the silence of a world grappling with the incomprehensible scale of its own unraveling. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe for more. They saw the imperial machinery not as a benevolent structure, but as an extractive mechanism designed solely to benefit the core at the expense of the periphery. This simmering discontent provided fertile ground for separatist movements and a profound sense of alienation from the imperial ideal. The military, once the embodiment of Roman order, became increasingly politicized. Loyalty shifted from the abstract idea of the emperor to the immediate commanders, who controlled the distribution of spoils and the allocation of scarce resources. Armies became instruments of personal power, their allegiance determined less by duty to the state and more by the promises of their generals. This transformation meant that, when the external threats intensified, the internal cohesion necessary for a unified defense simply vanished. Legions, instead of being a unified force, became a collection of semi-autonomous entities, their loyalty divided, their commitment wavering under the weight of competing loyalties. The final dissolution was thus a consequence not just of barbarian incursions, but of the internal corrosion that preceded them, a systemic failure, where the ambition that built the empire ultimately dismantled it from within, leaving behind a landscape defined by fractured authority and the echoes of a once mighty dominion. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe for more.